everyone, welcome to Ask a Political Scientist. I am your host, Andrea Jones-Rooy, and I am thrilled that you are here. Thank you so much to all who are returning viewers, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. Super happy to have you here. A little bit of background on me, if you don't know who I am a political scientist and a stand-up comedian, and in this show, we bring the two worlds of political science and stand-up comedy together at last. I know, it's what we've all been asking for this entire pandemic. Well, it's here. For those of you who don't already know, a little background on what we mean when we talk about political science. So political science is a two-step process. Step one is use scientific methods to understand politics. Step two, very important, step two is then be totally ignored by policymakers, voters, and everybody else, including my own family. Until now, this show is to help get the good news about political science research. Well, sometimes the findings are depressing, but the good news about the field overall out into the world. And I do want to flag, I have added an asterisk to this, that a lot of my family have been watching this show. This is our 19th show. We started when we all went indoors back in March, and many of them have watched every single show. And so now I think they have PhDs in political science. I'm pretty sure that's what they have. Today's topic is how to stay woke. We have a fantastic guest here who is an expert in this very topic. It's super timely. It's something that's absolutely on my mind, and I imagine on many of your minds as well. So that is what we are going to be talking about. More specifically, I like to cover three big topics in our hour together. We are going to talk about the vocabulary of staying woke. What are some of the key terms that are being tossed around? What do they really mean? We're going to talk about straightforward tips for everyday people on how to stay woke. And then we're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff in a lightning round, because there's so much to talk about from our political scientist. She has done so much work. We're going to talk about a concept that she calls racial stasis. We're going to talk about geography and urban and suburban policies. And we are going to talk about the Black mosaic. Our political scientist guest today, we have two guests. We have a political scientist and a stand-up comedian. Our political science guest today, we are so happy that she's joining us. We have Candace Watts-Smith. She is you can find her on Twitter at Prof. Candace. She is an associate professor of political science and African American studies at Penn State. She has also taught at Williams, Texas A&M, and UNC Chapel Hill, and she got her PhD at Duke University. We actually have a number of people who watch the show who went to Duke, including my boyfriend, who is real, and I think was at Duke at the same time as Candace, so I assume they're secretly best friends. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Candace to the show. Candace, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Are you staying safe and sane and all of that?
I'm staying safe. I'm staying safe in State College.
Very good. And so State College is fairly spread out. I don't know what the latest numbers coronavirus-wise are there. Everyone's okay? Or
I think, yeah. So okay. No one in my immediate family, there's only three of us,
okay,
or our neighbors who we have closed the loop with, has been infected to our knowledge, because it's not like we can go and get COVID tests whenever we feel like it.
Exactly. Yes. So to the best of our knowledge, indeed. And I live in New York City, and I do not want to close the loop with my neighbors. They, to my knowledge, are partying quite a bit, and I am keeping that. So hooray for being neighborly. So Candace, what I like to do before we dive into the substance of your research that we're here to talk about today is give folks watching who don't already know about you a little overview of some of your research. And it's going to be a little bit of a stalky, this is your life situation. Is that cool?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm ready.
All right, here goes. Whoops. There it is. So Candace is the co-author, most recently, came out in 2019, of a book called Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter. And we are going to talk about this book a whole bunch. It's a fantastic book. I recommend that everybody buy it. You can click the description for today's YouTube show, and there's a link to purchase the book, as well as Candace's other books, but you can also Google it. And just to give a quick overview, the description here, it's written for average folks, academics, and activists, an essential companion for those who are looking for guidance on their anti-racist journey, words for their thoughts, or instruction to help develop a more equitable society. So if I can't think of anything that I or many of the folks that I know would benefit more from than this book. So Candace, before we dive in, I want to quickly ask you, I mean, this came out in late 2019, which makes it the most prescient book I've ever heard of. What motivated you to write the book, and how is it being received in this 2020 conversations?
So the thing is that you know, people are like, oh, like you wrote this book just in time, except there be racism all the time.
Very interesting point. Right.
Like, you know, when we wrote it, there was racism. When we started, there was racism. All of those things.
Yes.
But I would say,
how did you discover racism? Wow, excellent.
I know. I mean, it's like I don't know. It's kind of like bittersweet, maybe is the word I'm looking for, that people are discovering racism. Like, you're late, but awesome. You know, like, we got to get you somewhere.
Right.
So really, the book came out of, I guess we started writing the book in 2017, maybe. I can't remember these things. Yeah. But the thing is that at that point, you know, Black Lives Matter, people were like, well, is it still a thing? You know, like, why did we have that? We already had a Black president and all of these things. And, you know, our students have, you know, they would ask the same questions kind of over and over again about like, well, is racism that bad? Have we changed? You know, and they use these words, and sometimes they use them incorrectly, or they use them in a way that's like, if you don't use it like I'm using it, then you're wrong and you're a racist. And it's like, whoa, hold on now. And so we mostly just thought about like, can we download our brains and then just be like, here's all of the questions, the frequently asked questions are answered to some degree here. So that was the motivation.
Excellent. Well, I am both, glad it's getting attention, and sorry it's still so needed. So we're going to be diving into exactly what you've been talking about, this sort of brain download that you described. And so the focus of our conversation is going to be on this book. Though for those of you watching, just to flag, and we will touch on these, Candace has written or co-written or co-edited lots of other books, including Racial Stasis, The Millennial Generation and the Stagnation of Racial Attitudes in American Politics. She was the co-editor of Black Politics in Transition, Immigration, Suburbanization, and Gentrification. And your first book, Candace, I believe, Black Mosaic, The Politics of Black Pan-Ethnic Diversity, which, correct me if I'm wrong, was based on your PhD dissertation.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. So we are going to touch on all three of these at the very end of the show. We will do none of them justice. I think I need to have you back at least 3 more times to do shows focused on each one. So clear your schedule and we'll be in touch. Yeah. All right.
I won't be going anywhere.
Yeah, that's true.
So let's do it.
Perfect. Yeah, I was. Those of you who've been watching the show before know that we're planning to take August off, but that's now canceled, and it's just going to be Candace through all of August. So done. All right. So Candace, we're so thrilled to have you here. Candace has also written a whole bunch of great papers on all kinds of topics, racial resentment, intersectionality, and much more. If you follow her at Prof. Candace on Twitter, you can find her website, or you can find her website in the comments underneath this video and check out all of her work. Candace, I'd like to bring on our comedian guest. How do you feel about that?
Let's do it.
Perfect. One of these days, I'm waiting for the political scientist to be like, I don't think so.
I'm good.
Yeah, no, we're good. No comedy here. So the guest that we have today, playing the role of comedian and representing the views of all non-political scientists everywhere, which is a totally fair thing to expect of somebody, is Esther Chen. She is an actor and comedian. You can follow her on Twitter and Instagram at @TheEstherChen. She has been on HBO, Amazon, Hulu, FX, lots more that I couldn't fit on this slide, as well as a regular performer at the 2-3 Comedy Club in Taipei. And she and I know each other from a science-forward comedy club here in New York City that used to sponsor this show called Caveat, and much, much more. Esther, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good morning.
Good morning. So Esther has agreed to join us from Taiwan, which is A, amazing, and B, as someone who never wakes up before 10 a.m., completely insane to me. And so I couldn't be more grateful. You are more dedicated to this show than anybody else, officially.
I've been waking up at 2 p.m., so this is usually when I don't know. I scratch myself awake.
Okay.
But I have to wake up for the show, so here I am.
Hooray. Well, I hope you're drinking coffee. The rest of us, I think, probably need a few drinks. Maybe you should have some drinks, too, at this point. I'm not even sure.
I had a lot of crackers. That's what was calling my name at 5 a.m.
Perfect. Sounds perfect. Well, we are so excited you're here. Esther, I have a little bit of a This Is Your Life as well for people watching at home. Are you ready?
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I don't even know. Oh.
It's if it's anything that comes as a surprise to you, I will be fascinated to hear the backstory on that. So I just wanted to flag some of the very awesome things that Esther has been up to. So if you're a fan of Succession, as I am, Esther has appeared on your screen already. So that's awesome. Jerry Seinfeld is a comedian hero of mine. Esther was in his promo trailer for his new Netflix special, making Esther a hero of mine. She already was, but now even more. Esther, what was it like working with Jerry Seinfeld? Please tell me he's a nice person. I don't like that pause.
I didn't grow up in the States in the 80s, so I didn't. I am aware that Jerry's like a super huge deal, but like my cells don't realize that. But from like the way people treat him, it feels like I'm like dealing with the president of China.
Huh.
Yeah. That's the best.
That cannot be a flattering comparison.
It's like he's a huge deal because the way people treat him.
Got it.
And I'm just kind of like, I don't know what to do with myself here.
Okay. Cool.
It's very surreal. It's kind of like there's like a god walking around and you're like, oh, I didn't realize. I don't know how to behave in front of a god, you know?
Okay. I expected a lot of topics to come up in this show, but I didn't expect Xi Jinping or God to come up. So thank you for that.
Well, I think it's also like, okay, so the actor on my left, he's a really cool guy, Colin. So the whole time I'm like, I don't know what to do with myself. And the whole time he's like cracking jokes with Seinfeld. And I was like watching them dying.
Okay.
Yeah, I was like, me, I'm the comedian. I need help. And like Colin's just like, la 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 la. And I'm like, I want what he has, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't like, how can you tell a joke in front of a god, you know?
Right. This is true. True. All right. New spin-off show, Jokes in Front of Gods. Stay tuned, everybody. Just to flag a few other awesome things. Esther was a dialect coach for several seasons of Mr. Robot. And I also want to shout out the last show that I saw you in New York City, which was back in early March before we all went inside, which was an awesome show co-produced by Esther and friend of the show and friend of mine, Kyle Marion, also co-hosted by them, called Asians Strike Back, which was a coronavirus comedy and science show all about unpacking some of the racist sentiment against Asians, the misinformation, the false science, and all of that stuff that was swirling in March. And has continued to be insanely relevant.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah,
we thought that this show was too late by that point for the virus.
Then
half an hour after the show, we had our first case in New York. Isn't that crazy? That
is crazy. Well, thank you for doing it. I hope there's a recording somewhere because it was a great show, and I recommend it to all. So thank you to you and Kyle for putting that together. All right, let us dive into the content. This is where to find Esther Chen. She is awesome, and we're so happy you're here. Last thing I want to note is we do raise money every single one of these shows. In lieu of tickets, we send the money straight to an organization that we think is doing good work. Our organization this week is the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, which works to end disenfranchisement and discrimination against people with convictions. Candace, this was your suggestion. Is this an organization you know well or are just a fan of?
Yeah, so Tehama brought this to my attention after Thursday's Supreme Court decision to allow Florida to require people to pay back their fees before they can cast their vote, which to me is unconscionable and unnecessary and ridiculous and a throwback in so many ways. She brought this to my attention, and then you ask, who we could focus our attention on. And I thought that this was a good one, especially in this moment right before, there's still like primaries happening. Not in Florida, but you know what I mean? We're getting ready to go into a major situation in November. And so it would be amazing if people could have the right to vote.
Yes, it indeed would be amazing if people could have the right to vote. And I think I'm really glad you brought this to my attention. Super timely. So please, if you have any money to spare, I know this is tough times for everyone, but in lieu of what you would pay for a ticket for a live show or whatever, just send it over to paypal.me/askaps, and I will send all the donations there right after the show. So thank you for that. All right, let us finally dive in. We're going to talk the vocabulary of staying woke, how to stay woke, and a bunch of other topics, racial stasis, geography, and the Black mosaic. As we go, this is a live interactive show. Hop onto the chat on the live stream and feel free to ask questions about anything that is coming up or anything you would like to direct to Candace or Esther. And I will fold them in as best that I can. The one thing I ask is talking about politics on the internet is a famously complicated experience. So let's be respectful. And if you want to disagree and be horrible, that's what Twitter is for. So hooray. All right. With that, let us dive in. So Candace, I want to talk about staying woke. And before I dive in on your recommendations and advice.
Okay. So I think can I take a step back? Is that all right?
Yes. Okay.
So I think that the reason what motivated this chapter in particular are kind of two reasons. One is that it is my sense that people are just using similar words totally differently. And then you're like, why are we having so much confusion? Because we are literally having we are having two different conversations, right? So, I mean, like even the word racism, for example, if your definition of racism is things that the Klan does, and my definition of racism is structural inequalities plus prejudice plus this plus that, and then you're like, how do we solve racism? Well, the Klan people are like, get rid of the Klan, we're good. And the structural people are like, oh, it's so complicated and we have to do rules and policies and this and that and the other. So one is just, the goal was to say, okay, can we have a similar conversation at the same time? The other thing I think is, I guess maybe on the other extreme or maybe a different side of the coin, I don't know, is that there are also people who are like, this is how this word is defined. And if you don't use it how I'm using it, then you can't get a say. And I think that one of the goals that Tehama and I have had, even in writing this chapter, because sometimes we're like, oh, is that how you use that word? Oh, okay, I use it like this. Oh, okay. Is that, I think some people become I think dogmatic is the word that I'm looking for. And it's like, well, can we have a little bit of wiggle room so that we can have so that we can all sit at the table and we can make some agreements about what things mean and how you can use it and how you can't use it. So that's the reason why we wrote this chapter. And also just because I think that the internet sometimes does good things. Like they provide like good words, like white-splaining. Like I love a good portmanteau.
Yeah.
Right. Like
sure.
You put two words together and you're like, shabam. Like that's a thing that many of us can identify with. Right. Or like massage noir. Right. Like a specific hatred toward Black women. Right. I think people have in the world of social media have like a really fine ability sometime to pinpoint a concept that we're all like, oh yeah, like I get that. Like I've seen that and now I have a word for it. So I don't know. So that's the step back. Okay, now let me answer your question.
Some examples of, I'm really glad you took that step back because I think underscoring the importance of, how much conversations and understanding can fall apart if we're using the same word, but we mean very different things. Even as you described that, I don't know about you, Esther, but I was like, oh, that explains a lot of what I'm seeing in the news and what I'm seeing on Twitter. Even something, calling someone racist and them saying, well, I'm not. Here's a picture of me next to a Black person. How could I be racist? And you're like, wow, that's not what I mean. So I think that's a key point. And thank you also for shouting out a good use of the internet because I so rarely remember that the internet has a force for good as well. So
sometimes it's a force for, this is a good show on the internet. It's a force for good.
I'll check in with you at the end of the show and you let me know if it's still any good. But for now, I'll take it. So what were some of so racism sounds like a huge word that needs unpacking. What were some of the other words that you decided, you and you both decided to focus on?
Yeah, some of the words were like things that we think are just kind of words that people use as common sense that should be unpacked. So for example, like meritocracy. Ooh. Right? Like, oh, we live in a meritocracy and if you just work hard, then this and that. And like, the United States is not a meritocracy. It's a lot of things, but it's not a meritocracy, right? And so, we have words like this, or things that people say that just aren't real, like reverse discrimination. Like why is that? Like, if it's discrimination, it's just discrimination. What makes it reverse?
Yeah.
These kinds of things. Or I don't know. Oh, like false equivalency. That's one of my favorite ones. And mostly because like it's a thing that we see all the time. So, and like the president of the United States is very good at giving us a false equivalence, right? So like the Confederate flag is just like waving a Black Lives Matter flag, like, which is asinine.
Right.
And, then people are kind of like, well, wait, like, well, people have their rights. And it's like, these aren't the same. Like, not everything has the same moral weight. Right. Why are we putting them in conversation with each other? So I don't know. Were there any words that stick out to you that, that come to mind?
Well, I am actually curious. I have some words, but I'm curious about this term meritocracy, because I work a lot with companies, and they all claim to be, well, not all, but many of them claim to be meritocracies, and would even go as far as recognizing that the U.S. is not a meritocracy, but within our walls, we're a meritocracy, as though they've somehow broken the spell.
Yeah, which is wild.
Yeah, and I'm curious if you've gotten pushback on your, I think, correct assertion that it's not a meritocracy in the U.S.
I have been lucky enough that weirdos haven't reached out to me yet.
Great, good. I'm glad to hear that. Esther, you divide your time between the U.S. and Taiwan. Is that fair?
I would say it's hilarious, because like I grew up here, but now that I'm back and as an adult for like long term, still some stuff's like really shocking. Yeah. So let's see. I can't even start with the amount of sexism. I thought it's like, oh, come on, that's so ancient, that's blah blah blah, but it's so present, and it's like impossible to eradicate, because it's rooted in the language, it's rooted in our customs, it's rooted in everything. You're literally altering the culture in some sense by not existing. And I was thinking about this yesterday. I don't think my dad has seen a person that is not of Mandarin descent in probably 5 years. Actually, wait, my boyfriend's Korean, so I guess he saw one Korean person last year.
Well, diversity, done. Yeah.
Like, even, I mean, and it's crazy because my family works a lot with, we do English learning. So we have a lot of teachers from all over the world that comes to teach English. But even then, my dad doesn't deal with it. So even like the talk about Black Lives Matter, and Taipei, we had our own version of Black Lives Matter, and we're talking about how like a big part of it is like, how do we start to discuss this with our family who has no experience with any of this talk at all? Yeah.
I have a question.
Only there was someone who had it. Yeah. Yes.
So, okay, wait, can you tell me what Black Lives Matter looks like in Taiwan?
Yes. We had a protest. It's a peaceful protest. It was at the 228 Peace Memorial Park. The 228 Peace Memorial Park, there was a really bloody massacre. This goes into Taiwan's history with China, but there was a really bloody massacre. And so we have a Peace Memorial Park for it. So the people that mostly showed up were definitely, I would say, 50% people of African descent from all over the world. So they could be French, they could be from Africa or from the States. And then I would say another, probably the next largest majority is like Asian Americans in Taiwan at the moment. And then the next biggest chunk is like Caucasians that are based in Taiwan, for maybe they're here to teach English, or maybe they're here for missionary purposes, church staff. So there's that. So they did, what did we do? We did, he was knelt on his neck for
George Floyd.
George Floyd. And so we held a moment of silence for as long as the time that he was held on his neck. There was a whole banner of all the people that were killed by police, and we repeated after all of their names. There was a huge banner behind, and they had a whole list. So whenever they said a name, and if you resonated with it, you also repeated the name. The whole thing was about, like, I want to say maybe 3 hours.
So it was U.S. focused.
Yes, it was U.S. focused.
Mm-hmm.
Completely U.S. focused.
Are there conversations continuing about Black Lives Matter in the U.S. in Taiwan? So one of the reasons I thought of you to show, A, you're awesome, and B, you had been quite active posting and talking about these issues, and so I really wanted to hear your perspectives. Is this still?
There was this really interesting thing that happened. So I had an African comedian who participated, who was one of the producers of a Black Lives Matter event. It's called Speaking Out Loud, a discussion about racism. And he wanted me to go onto the show and do comedy. And I've never like had to think about a show more than actually prepare for it. I thought about this for like weeks, because it's like, okay, yeah, as an Asian person living in America, I felt racism, but is this the place for me to like, oh yeah, I understand Black Lives Matter because I've experienced racism? And I didn't know how to communicate that with him because he asked me to do the show. And then I had to discuss this with like a couple of my Taiwanese friends. And the thing is, like, this took me a long time to understand as well, that being an Asian person in America is a privilege in comparison to Black Lives Matter. And that's something we don't understand, because like, yeah, we deal with racism. Like, the shit we have to deal with is not fun. Like, how can you quantify my experience in comparison to something else? It's not fair. And so I had to tell my friend, I was like, well, he's also a comedian. So I was like, well, remember that new bit with like Roy Wood Jr.? He's like, and his premise was like, oh, I'm going to Best Buy, and the lady's like, oh, would you like to like save the dolphins of the world by not having to use a plastic bag? And he was like, nah, I need the plastic bag. This ain't about the environment. I need that bag. And also, I need you to print that receipt. This is not about like some recycling, saving the trees. I need that receipt, and I need that bag. And I was like, it's like small things like that. It's like, I was telling him, I was like, you and I can walk into a store, and if we walked out of it with an item in our hands, we would never have to be questioned because of how we look. And that's what we don't understand, that it is a privilege. Like, yes, our shell of being the like people who will never steal because we're good people is damaging, but that doesn't, in comparison to like being questioned and being discriminated against by walking out of a store, even if you paid for something, it's completely different. And he was like, Esther, I think that's why that Black comedian wanted you to do that show, because we need you as a medium to communicate with Taiwanese people why this matters. And I felt like really caught in the middle, because it's like, I don't know how to do that. Like he was like, well, just say to them what you just said. I was like, I know, but I'm like using an example because I understand you. I know what's going on in your mind. So I can use Roy Wood Jr. to help you communicate. But they want me to do comedy. It's like,
so you haven't done it yet.
No, I said no to it. And I waited, and I felt so shitty because I waited till the day of to tell him that I couldn't do it. Because I kept thinking. And him and my Asian comedian friend and we had this discussion the night before. Because I was telling him, I was like, I still don't know what to do. I have 24 hours left. I don't know if I should say yes or no, because it matters to me, but like, I don't know what's the right thing to do right now.
So Candace, I want to actually use that moment. So Esther, thank you for sharing that, because it brings up something that in my mind is a list of words that we misunderstand, which you just described, which is privilege and how it works. You know, I think about white privilege as a white person. You mentioned, Esther, Asian privilege in the United States, or this idea that there's privileges, or you know, how do you, Candace, think about the idea of privilege and how it plays out for us?
Yeah, I mean, so even that example that Esther gave is so good, because I mean, it's all relational, right? So I think even, for example, like people are like, well, Asians have good, like, are all stereotypes bad? There's like great stereotypes about Asians, like they're smart and they're this and they're that. But like every stereotype has a purpose, right? And so like even the kind of like model minority, very smart Asian stereotype is relational to anti-Blackness, right? So it's like, well, if they did it, then how come you can't do it?
Right.
But it also like dismisses the discrimination that Asian Americans face, right? So we might think about even just kind of like, well, Asian Americans tend to be more entrepreneurial, but that's also in part because they're not accepted or welcomed into like larger corporate entities, right? And so, you know, even like this good stereotype elides elides the particular challenges that various, you know, people in different, you know, there's all sorts. I mean, Asian American is like this glump of like people who have nothing in common except that the United States put them in a box together, right?
Right.
So I would say, I mean, and you know, like, you know, we think about white privilege as mostly just kind of like a set of advantages. And I think that it's best understood when we think about averages, right? So like social scientists, our currency is in averages, not in anecdotes. And so when we talk about white privilege, we're talking about the kind of typical, generally speaking, advantages that come to white folks on average as a group. I mean, like, of course, individual people get stuff, right? So, I mean, it could be like the benefit of the doubt, right? And like even the story that Esther is telling is about who's getting the benefit of the doubt by walking out of a store without a receipt and a bag, right? That is a privilege of benefit of the doubt. But then there's also just kind of, you know, like just having greater access to opportunities, generally speaking, right? I think that's probably maybe the best way to say that about white privilege in the US. And I imagine that there's like white privilege in Taiwan, right? That like being white accrues you a series of benefits just by your mere, like just by your mere racial group category, right? That like, oh, you must be smart, you must be hardworking, you must be trustworthy, you must know how to navigate these spaces, et cetera, et cetera.
So we actually have a question. So first I want to shout out to folks in the chat. We have Melissa and Andrea both cheering for the book cover in the background, Candace, which is awesome. So hooray for that. And Melissa is asking, Esther, was there any talk about racism in Taiwan during these conversations, or was it racism? And Candace, you basically just brought this up, or was it about racism in the US that was being discussed in these conversations?
I think it was more about Black Lives Matter in Taiwan. And I think one really cool thing that the people on stage at the very, very end, they were like, we just want you guys to like turn to each other and just brainstorm one thing that you think you can do. And it was hilarious. I turned to this guy. He was this African-American dad, and his daughter was on stage. And I realized that, so I had gone to an international school for 2 years, and we realized that his kids went to the same school. And because I was like, oh, why are you in Taiwan, you know? And what's hilarious is like, when I was in school, I remember there was one Black kid in the entire school. It was a big school. We had probably like 200 people each class. It was a big school. And it was like pre-K all the way to high school senior. There was one Black kid. And I remember he probably was only in school for maybe 2 months. And he was so severely, I'm not sure if he was bullied or what, but he disappeared really fast. And so then the dad was telling me, he was like, that's hilarious. Like there's only one other Black family in the school when my kids were in school. But we shared this, the same last name. And so every time he went to a PTA meeting, he was getting all the information about the other kids that weren't his. But it's interesting. I think like, with the whole Black Lives Matter, we talked about like what we could possibly do, but I don't think it really addressed not the main, but like there's many, many different kinds of racism going on. We have racism against Indigenous people in Taiwan. We have, you know, we have white expats working in Taiwan, and the way we treat them is very different as well. We put them on a pedestal to put in very generic terms. But I feel like these are also things we need to talk about, but we definitely didn't address any of that.
Mm-hmm. So this brings me to exactly where I wanted to go next, which was to ask, what do we do? And it sounds like, Esther, that's exactly what you were talking about that. So I want to talk about, Candace, you have a lot of recommendations in your book about what do we do about this? And one of the chapters is even called, It Doesn't Have to Be This Way. What are some of the things for people who want to work towards racial justice can be doing?
So, okay.
Easy question. So easy. I know,
right? It's like, where do I start?
Yeah.
So I think that it's important for us to remember that in almost every aspect of American life, we can find evidence of racism, right? We can find evidence where Black people and various, people of color are, granted less benefits than whites. Okay. And so what that means is that there's a lot of things for a lot of people to do, and no one has to do everything. And that would be ridiculous for anyone to believe. And so, I've gotten emails from I got this email from this pastor, and he was like, hey, should I go to my city council and help them with blah, 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 blah. And I was like, dude, I bet your church is segregated AF. Mm-hmm. So what are you doing at your church? Or, someone who is coming from a bank is like, well, how do you think about your policies about loans and, all of these things, right? Or, if you're a mom and you stay at home with your kids, awesome. You are a teacher, right? And so you have the capacity to, from small things make sure your kids have books with people of color, different color people in them, or that you can have conversations with your kids about fairness, right? Kids know what fairness is, right? And then how can we turn that conversation and to a conversation about equity, right? So I'm not answering your question directly, but only to say that everyone can do something in their sphere of influence, right? Whether it's your work, your home, your church, your community, your whatever, your religious practices, there's something there that you have some influence over that could close the gap in that sphere, right? And some people have more money, right? You have a lot of money, awesome, donate. Donate to causes and organizations that are already doing the work. Right. Maybe you are an excellent artist, create some art that brings awareness. Maybe you are a computer science student, use your tech skills to help someone create something that provides more information to your legislators. So, we're just mostly saying that everyone can do something, that there's plenty of problems to be solved, and that if we kind of have a, what do you call division of labor, right? If we have a division of labor, right, then we can kind of work in all of these aspects of our society to address the many, many problems that we have.
Well, I think it's both sounds very simple in the sense of, well, look around and see what's, seems unjust or seems like you could influence the world and make it better. That seems both very simple and also something that I am not hearing other people say. I am not thinking about as a white person. I am thinking about, oh gosh, it's structural and it's systemic. How can we change the whole economy so it's different? And I'm talking about discrimination in housing policies, and I'm thinking about voting. I think about this, and it's and what have I done about any of those things other than, read the internet, right? And education is important. I'm not making a difference by doing that. And so it's really powerful to be reminded that, oh, look around you, fix what you can see, right?
Yeah, and also there are already organizations and people who have made their lives doing this.
Yeah.
Right. And so go ask them what to do, right?
Yeah.
How can you help them?
Yeah.
It's not everyone wants, you don't have to create a 503c or whatever it is. You don't have to start from the start, You don't have to start from the beginning. You can help folks who are already doing the good work in your community.
Right. And by the way, speaking of donations, here's the NPR pledge drive time. You can send donations right here, and we'll send them straight to the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, speaking of organizations that are doing good work. So please do that. Did anything, Esther, when you all talked about, what it was that you could do, what sorts of things did you all think of or talk about?
My personal one was, I get the highest question I asked the biggest comment I'm being told / asked every time someone finds out I live in New York City is, where do you live? Are there a lot of Black people in that neighborhood? And it's like one of those questions, like, this is such a, we don't even share the vocabulary. Where do I start?
Right.
What is my jumping off point? We're literally living in two different platforms when someone asks me that question.
Mm-hmm.
And very often people who ask me this question are people that I don't know very well. Like someone I met at a party, a friend's friend's friend, like a friend's weird cousin's friend. It's like so far, and we're probably like under some like just really loud music, and the person's probably had a couple drinks. That when I was talking to the dad who was standing next to me, I told him I think that's one very simple thing I could do. And then I tried doing it and I didn't. I was like, how do I communicate with someone who already doesn't care for me and is really just making conversation because he's forced to, because he's like right next to me. And we don't even share like the basics. Like with my friend who's a comedian, okay, we're colleagues. There's things I can explain. I can point things out to him and help, and not necessarily like correct him, but I can share my insight and hope that he accepts. With someone who doesn't have any common grounds with me, I'm just like, or has like no understand. Like I remember the first time I used the word racism in my life, I was 15 years old and I didn't even know how to say it. I've heard of the word in Chinese, but the word didn't have a lot of meaning to me. Mm. And I was using this word when I was in a children's choir. We were touring all over the world. And at one stop, I think we were in Finland or something, some Nordic country. And there was like the boys from Latvia, they were bullying us. And that's the only reason I could come up with. But that's the first time I experienced it, like that late in the game. And so I understand why he says that, because he's never dealt with it. He's never experienced it. And he doesn't have knowledge or infrastructure or anything to start with that. And I don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. As far as, what to say to someone like this, first, it sounds like Candace's book needs to be translated. Would be a step forward. But what you're describing sounds like a much more intense version, because you're really working from two platforms, as you say. But it sounds like what a lot of people, even here in the US, where we speak ostensibly the same language, are running into when we have conversations with people we know from high school or distant family members or whatever, who maybe use racism in totally different ways than we do, as Candace said at the beginning, or are totally resistant or shut down when any of these kinds of conversations come up. Candace, do you have recommendations for these sorts of difficult conversations in your book?
Yeah. I mean, I think the main thing is just to ask some questions. Like, what do you mean by that? I understand you to mean so-and-so. Is that correct? Because I think that, we're just like, are we talking about the same thing? Are we on the same page? And I think that sometimes even just stopping to pause to ask those questions gets us farther along, right? It can like course correct earlier than later, right?
Yeah, and getting people to explain their side of things or what they mean might be revealing enough to themselves as they articulate what they're
that's the thing that happens with my students a lot. Like, did you mean to say that Brown versus Board of Education was decided wrong? Is that what you meant? And then they're like, oh, that does sound really bad. Yeah.
What are some of the most, I'm so curious, some of the most common misunderstandings that you're encountering, either from your students or as people are receiving the book? Like, what is it that people are really kind of stumbling over?
Yeah, the one that people from the media call me all of the time, and they're like, hey, Black Lives Matter is about policing and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, okay, no. Well, yes. But, I think that like what has happened is that we have like this cartoon like depiction of Black Lives Matter. So now that people are on board, right? Because like in 2014, people were like, oh, Black Lives Matter sounds like, bad. All lives matter, white lives matter, blue lives matter. And, shift 6 years later, they're like, yeah, Black Lives Matter. Let's focus on policing. Mm-hmm. And Black Lives Matter is about all types of anti-Black violence. And, in schools, in health, in housing, and all of these things. So I think one of the things that people are getting flustered by is this business of policing, which absolutely should be addressed. But what I'm getting nervous about is that people are so focused on policing that they're forgetting about, or not even cognizant of, all of the other ways that Black women, Black men, formerly incarcerated, trans, immigrant, undocumented people, Black people are facing anti-Black racism, right? In very different ways. So I think that's one that I'm like really, I'm trying to keep people aware that if it's not on video, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
Right.
And so this business of like, I find this moment very interesting because so many people are galvanized by like this incredibly disgusting, gross, brutal, horrific, slow death of George Floyd. But like, there are other ways that Black people are dying very slow deaths in ways that people can't see on camera. And right. People aren't focusing on that. And so I really hope that that's one thing that I see people kind of flatten that I think can be dangerous in the long run.
We had Christian Davenport from the University of Michigan on a few shows ago, and we talked there about, we were talking about violence, government-led violence, and indeed, this is still from a government perspective, but a point that I thought was really helpful was, a government failure to provide public health equally for everyone is a kind of violence that kills people. And I'm more or less just re-saying what you said, but I think that the health disparities, of course, are something that are, we're talking about public health more this year than we ever have, but the differences in outcomes, the differences in access in every aspect of life, not just health, not just the economy.
Yeah.
Do you find I'm curious what you think, because when I encounter conversations about Black Lives Matter, I feel like I hear because everyone wants to know what do you think, white person? Here's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing police brutality, and then I hear at the way other end of things, microaggressions, which are, this is my loose one-dimensional oversimplification. Is microaggressions is one of those buzzwords that's sort of in the ether as well. Is that something that people are misunderstanding? What are your thoughts on that term?
So I think actually, I thought you were going to say implicit bias.
But I
think they're like friends.
Yeah. I think they're, I was like cousins, sisters. I got really wrapped up.
Yeah, they're like they're cousins. Let's say cousins.
Right.
They know each other.
Yes.
And I think like it's like police brutality is what the state does, and then maybe I do microaggressions.
Right.
Right. Which is like, isn't that bad? It's micro.
Right.
And so I think though that like the business of microaggressions that people miss is the that it's in the aggregate. It's like one incident is like, okay, yeah, sure. But it's because Black people of color of all just stripes there's different microaggressions for various groups, right? So like, I guess a microaggression for me would be, you're so articulate. Whereas like for Esther, I'm just gonna guess that someone has said to you something like, you speak English very well. I mean, but both of these are about language and like who the English language belongs to and who it doesn't belong to. And that somehow if you speak very good English, that means you're like a good, like you're belonging, you're good enough to, you know, you've met a standard of whiteness in some way. Mm-hmm. And so I think that people dismiss microaggressions because they're like, well, it's now almost never intentional, but that's because we often put more weight on white people's intentions than we do on Black people's feelings, right? That like, oh, well, you didn't intend to hurt their feelings, but you did. So how do we remedy that, right? In part, it's by recognizing that you've done something offensive, and then maybe like a pinky promise that you will not do that again, right? Yep. And that you will learn more and do better, right, in the next iteration. So I think microaggressions in some ways is for people to just be like, well, I'm kind of racist.
Right, but they're little and I didn't mean it. So
and they're little and I didn't mean it, but like for a person of color, it comes, they come, I don't know, what is it about like 1,000, death by 1,000?
Right. 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, it's like that.
Yeah. Well, and Esther, the examples you were describing of, you know, the you know, leaving a store without a bag or a receipt and the assumptions made around that, and even the question that you're asked at this party, those to me strike me as maybe even more than microaggressions if someone is actually stopping you and you know, at what point it becomes an aggression as opposed to a micro, I don't know, but these daily, you know, interactions and assumptions that you're both describing. Right?
For sure. I think even as like an actor, it's very often like, I had this really interesting audition experience.
Yeah, I was about to say, I remember I saw on YouTube, because I stalked you a little, about like, you were at an audition and they were like, they wanted like the super most Chinese person. Huh. And it was like, what the, you know, like, okay, go ahead. Okay, sorry, I interrupted you. But that really resonated with me.
That's only like, that exactly, that I'm sure all actors of different marginalized groups, we all have really interesting stories like that. Or like, oh, I had this audition where they're like, this ad runs in China, so behave a certain way. And we're like, okay, I think I understand what you mean by that, but also you don't have to yell at us about it. And they were very aggressive about it. And also it's like, do you want me to do my makeup differently? Do you want me to dress differently? What do you mean behave more Chinese? You know, behave more fresh off the boat. But I had this audition for a regional theater, and it was the very, very first time I walked out of an audition feeling like I was going to throw up, and I couldn't understand why. And like my understanding of racial politics is quite limited because, you know, I've lived in America for maybe like 14 years by myself, and without my parents. So I'm sort of like the first person in my family learning about this. I was called in for a play where I play a Chinese hacker. And back in the day, it's like, well, yeah, whatever, you know, like play it. Like a lot of plays are about communist China, even though I'm aware of the big, you know, big brother and the big bully, I guess, next to us. But I didn't grow up during the Cultural Revolution. I didn't personally experience it, but for so many of Asians and Asian Americans, that's the story we have to tell, because people are interested in the poverty story, or they're interested in the communist story. So these things didn't bother me in the past, but this time it was, the director is a very kind, nice, older white man from the South. Let me just put it there. And we had very, very little time to prepare for the audition. I had maybe like 8 hours for like a 10-page side. So then I do my thing, and then he asked me, he was like, tell me, what are your thoughts on China? And as a person who's grown up in Taiwan, I have a lot to say about it, because that's literally our entire hemisphere. So I go on this whole spiel. I was like, basically along the lines of like, I don't like how America uses my poverty and my experience and my history for them to win an Oscar. Like every time we have a documentary about what the communist government does to its people are like, Oscar, Sundance. And then I do this whole thing about, it's so frustrating that people are always shocked, like, oh, even with the news of like the doctor who spoke to everyone about the coronavirus and he died. When I first found about that news, my first instinct was like, he didn't die that simply. Something happened in between, because I understand how communist China works. Nobody else does. I'm like, I know something happened. As a man in his early 30s, it's not that easy for him to die from the coronavirus because of his pre-existing conditions. I know somebody has a hand in it, blah, blah, blah. So he watched me give that speech and he was like, that's the girl I wanted in the audition. Where was that girl? That's the girl I wanted to see. Why didn't you bring her to the audition? And he was like praising me of the speech that I had rather than me putting my best foot forward on the 10-page slides that he gave me, which was only given to me the day before. And I walked out of it feeling really confused because he applauded me for what I did, but also, I don't know what the right verb is, but me for not bringing that to the audition.
Yeah.
And then I knew I was going to get a call back, and I knew I didn't want to work with this person. And I felt like I was going to show up, and I didn't. I felt a very visceral feeling like I was going to puke. And I didn't know what to I now, like a couple months later, I have a better understanding, but like at the time, and I also didn't have anyone to turn to explain this experience. The way that auditions are set up, it's like every Asian actor is in competition with each other because there's only room for one of us.
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna like call up an Asian actor who's like, hey, I experienced this. Oh, you didn't get an appointment, Yeah. And so then my first thing was I called a white female friend of mine who couldn't understand my experience and instead said to me, he's like, Esther, I think you just don't like plays.
We call that gaslighting.
Sorry, on behalf of white people. Ooh, bad rep for the team. I mean, what I'm hearing is a very painful experience and a commodification of your anger, right? Or your genuine expression of a frustrating situation.
Yeah.
To me, it sounds like a kind of racism.
Yeah, and I can't do anything.
Right.
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
Right. I mean, that's like the power part of it, right? And I think that we often forget about power. Like people, like some people are in a more powerful position and they leverage it over you in a way that further disadvantages you in that position. So like, what was he expecting you to do? Right?
Yeah, we had 8 hours. It was an enormous amount of material with very, very little time. And if you had wanted me to hear that passionate speech, I guess you didn't really need me to do all that work. I mean, I stayed up. I mean, I got the slides at 6. I stayed up until 3 a.m. to break it down and memorize it. I went to bed for like 5 hours, woke up and worked on it even more, and then I went in.
Now I feel extra bad making you get up super early. Oh, God, interpreting all the horrible things.
I've had much worse. This is not terrible.
So we just have a handful of minutes left. I want to encourage folks watching, if you want to shout out questions over the live chat, happy to take those. But I want to jump and make sure we touch on a couple of other key themes from your work, Candace. So a book that really, I think is really important is Racial Stasis, which is a book that you have co-authored. And in this book, the argument is the millennial generation. It's about the millennial generation and the stagnation of racial attitudes in American politics. I'm curious about what you mean by stagnation of racial attitudes, and then, of course, how you think about that in 2020. Are we still stagnated, which I'm very much open to being?
So, okay. So, there's always basically like this myth that the United States is always it's like in a linear progression of racial liberalism, and there's actually no data for that. And so we look at, there's this measure in political science called the racial resentment scale. And if you look at the resentment scale from mid-80s, which is when I was born, until when we wrote this book, the line was just flat. And so this business of like always progressing and all of these things is like, there's no data for that. And so, Chris DeSanti and I are both millennials. And we're like, yeah, like white millennials be doing some crazy stuff sometimes, right? And it's like, oh, I can tell racist jokes because I'm so not racist. And right, like they have like a very myopic understanding of what racism is. Again, back to that kind of overt, overt racism thing. And so what we aim to show is two things. One is that millennials are not necessarily doing the kind of work that we tend to believe that they're doing. And two, this is more like of the, like quirky, jargony part, is that even the way that we're measuring racial attitudes we may be not even picking up on the way that the logic that people use, the words that people use to explain racial disparities by using a measure that was created before I was born. So I think that now people are like, oh, well, aren't you going to write a new book now that all the white people are woke? And I'm like, I'm going to wait and see. And here's why. Is because I think that people can say, like, it's good that more people are like, institutional racism is a thing. Check. I love diversity. Check. We should, like these things. These are good. But now the question is, what policies do we put in place? Are you willing to support to ameliorate racial disparities? That's going to be the key, right? So like people are still like, I don't know if we should do an affirmative action. That's so weird. Or, like we should have diversity, but that seems like it's antithetical to meritocracy and quality. And so that's what racial states is about. Is like, are we going to be able to close the gap between excuse me, let me say this. The question that remains now is, are we going to be able to close the gap between people's principles and their policy preferences as it concerns racial disparities in the US?
And the argument that we aren't as progressive as we think we are, or as woke as we think we are, I think is a really powerful one for also a millennial thinking, yeah, this is the generation of openness and wokeness and, checking our biases and all these sorts of things. Do you feel any different about Gen Z? There's a lot of fuss about Gen Z finally changing things for us.
No, and here's why. I mean, there's always, look, generational movement is always potential for change. Yeah. Right. That there's potential that they could be different. But we have to keep in mind that like Gen Z didn't just fall out of the sky and socialize themselves. Right. They have like, they're raised by us and they're raised by, boomers and Gen X. Yeah. Sorry, Gen Xers. Like they're still gonna get their ideas from us. And are we gonna equip them to do the things that we want to do? Right. So people are always saying that millennials are gonna do stuff. They're going to like eradicate racism, but we don't actually have the tools to do any of those things. And so it's really ultimately up to us whether the next generation is going to be more able to have the tools to dismantle systems of oppression.
And this goes right back to where we started with your recommendation that, hey, if you have children, this is a great opportunity to teach and prepare the next generation, right? And think about policies in your local communities. And so forth. What you're describing makes me think of the social science concept, more jargon hour, of revealed preferences, right? Where we state that, oh yes, I support this and I support this and I support this. And they say, okay, well, vote for this policy, show up for this protest, send money to this organization. And then all of a sudden you aren't doing it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So we'll have to, we'll see. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Okay. I'll take cautious optimism over no optimism. Esther, what about you on as far as racial justice around the world? So US and Taiwan, or generally, how optimistic or not? It's a huge question, but where are you landing on this?
Oh my gosh. I mean, at least for Taiwan, very not optimistic. We have a far long way to go. Yeah. Really, really far. I mean, I don't even think there is no talk about sexism. So little, so little. And racism is like almost non-existent. Far way to go.
How about your in your 14 years in the U.S.? I mean, you haven't been here for the last few months, but apart from I think a lot more white people paying attention to things and the protests, the same issues were there for the 14 years.
Yeah. I think I'm really lucky as an actor, because as an actor, I am able to be more in touch with rhetorics like these. I think if I had like a regular 9-to-5 job, I think it's going to be very, very different.
Right.
I have no idea.
Right. Very well.
Great answer.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. I want to touch on these last couple topics, and we're going to wrap up. So your Black Mosaic book, and we hit on this a tiny bit when we talked about different, Black as not a monolith identity, right? And so this book, Black Mosaic, the politics of Black pan-ethnic diversity. Why is it important as we have these conversations about Black Lives Matters and racial equity to be reminded and think about the fact that not all Black people are, the same identity as we think about these things?
Yeah, so I guess then one of the concepts in Stay Woke is intersectionality, right? Which is just to think about how people have multiple identities where they're situated in various hierarchies, right? I mean, basically, so I guess maybe an example would be helpful, right? Is that among Black people, we tend to say like, we tend to think that they are certain kind, like they are from the inner city or they are from the South or whatever. But there are plenty of different kinds of Black folks. And that book is just talking about ethnicity and country of origin. I think in this moment, this becomes very important because like when we talk about DACA or when we talk about immigration policy, though we tend to have our American imagination about what an immigrant or a DACA recipient is a Latino person, right? Is a Latinx person. Whereas we know that there are Asian American DACA recipients. There are, African DACA recipients. There are DACA recipients from all over the world. And, we also know that if you have like high policing, that undocumented Black immigrants are more likely to be caught up in the system in ways that other kind of undocumented immigrants are not. So again, just my hope always is just to say that like there are various people have special challenges depending on the different categories that they belong to simultaneously. That was saying a lot.
No, I think it's an important reminder, and I think it's very easy to oversimplify. And again, whether it's in the United States or I feel that we can complicate it even further to think about Black lives outside of the United States, whether it's in Taiwan or what's, each different countries in Europe or so forth. Finally, okay, so this is truly lightning round of all your work, but I really want to touch on this. So immigration, suburbanization, gentrification. So how does this play out in different spaces and geographies?
So that was kind of what we were going for there, is just thinking about, all right, well, there's immigration, right? There's different kinds of Black people here, but then also immigration policy influences Black people differently, generally speaking, right, than white folks, right? Just if we think about jobs and public services, and it's not necessarily like there's not an argument, like there's not like necessarily a fight, a competition for resources, because the United States has tons of resources and we are just made to feel like we should be in a fight when we shouldn't, right? Suburbanization, there is like, we have very stagnant understandings about what the suburbs look like per the United States president. And that turns out that there are a lot of Black people who live in the suburbs, that like the inner city, the inner city is often cold for Black, it's not cold for white, but these are actually very old tropes that are not helping us to solve the problems that we have today. What's the third one? Gentrification. Oh, it's about neighborhood change, right? So, I think that neighborhood change is really important to think about, because we tend to say like, okay, well, if you work hard and you can get to like the best neighborhoods, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be welcome there. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to like see the same benefits of living in those spaces. And so really just kind of thinking about like, what does moving up, right, and moving out mean for Black people in the US?
Yeah. Well, and I think this, again, is just such an important reminder to the theme from early on, which goes back to what's happening in your local community and what are the things you can do to make change and fight for equity and justice and all of those things. And that's going to vary whether you're in a city, whether you're in the suburbs, whether you're talking about immigrant communities and where from, and different intersectionalities within different groups. And that goes for the Black community, goes for the Asian American community, which again, as correctly pointed out, is a ton of different people from a huge, vast part of the world that Americans have decided is the same thing.
Yeah.
Yep. So I want to respect both of your time. So I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you both so much for being here. Esther, I hope you can go back to bed or or not, but thank you for kicking off your morning with these important conversations. I'm going to remind folks to follow you and find you on the internet. Esther, let's start with you. Where can people find you and keep up with your goings on?
Yeah, at all platforms at the Esther Chen _.
The Esther Chen _. Fantastic. And Candace, what about you?
At Prof. Candace.
Excellent. Cool.
And only on Twitter. I don't fool with the Facebook.
Good for you. I did stalk you on there because I tag everyone and everything. And I was like, anytime I don't find someone on Facebook or Instagram, I feel envious of you. So well done there. Sticking to Twitter is wise. And frankly, I'll be honest, even Twitter, I freak out.
Yeah.
Yes, they all have their evils. And my name is Andrea Jones-Rooy, and we are here every week. We are actually only here next week, next Thursday. You can find out more about next Thursday's show. We have Angela X. Ocampo from the University of Michigan and comedian Igor Martinez joining us. And we are going to talk about Angela's research defining and measuring this concept of belonging, which actually we've touched on a bit. And she has done a lot of research in the Latinx community in the United States, but also a variety of other communities. So come learn about belonging and quantifying and quantitative research around belonging and how it influences political behavior, such as going to vote or running for office and all kinds of other things that we care about. So that's where you can go to find out and register in advance for the show. And of course, you can still send donations. They are going straight to the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. So start being part of the change. Here's a small thing you can do right now to make a difference. And we do send all the money over. I can show you receipts at the end to prove that I did make the donation. So there's that. All right. That's it. Thank you both again. Thank you everyone who watched. Have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.